So in this PowerPoint, we're going to cover the lymph and immune system, and I've tagged them together because they actually work hand in hand with each other to help, number one, filter out any pathogens in your body, and number two, it really does have a function in circulation. So what you see here is a blood vessel, the artery, and it moves blood around and it takes it to the capillaries. Now, from the capillaries, you have to filter out things like water, solutes into the tissues. And from the tissues, you're supposed to collect back any extra fluid in addition to waste to take it back to the heart. Now, because we're not perfect beings, not all the water and all the waste from the tissues goes into the capillaries to go back into your cardiovascular system. So instead you have a backup mechanism, and that's going to be what's called your lymphatic system. And in all the illustrations that I show to you, it's going to be what's in green. So this lymphatic system is actually responsible for picking up extra fluids so you don't get things like edema or swelling of the tissues. And it puts it into the lymphatic capillaries to take it back. And eventually it's going to dump it back into the veins that will go back into your heart and circulate again. Now, what you're going to learn is that not only do these guys pick up extra fluid, but they're also going to pick up things like pathogens, bacteria, viruses. They're going to pick up things like cancer cells. And along the way, you'll see lymph nodes, not on this picture, but in the coming illustrations. And those lymph nodes are responsible for filtering those pathogens and starting an immune system response when necessary. So the order of those lymphatic vessels is that we're going to start off at the lymphatic capillaries. And from the capillaries, we're going to move on to lymphatic vessels, then lymph trunks, then lymph ducts. From the lymphatic capillaries, this is going to be the first place where we actually pick up any extra fluids and bacteria, pathogens, cancer cells. And it's because just like any other blood capillary you have, lymph capillaries are a single cell layered thick, which means that they're highly permeable. And that means that you can allow solutes, fluids, bacteria to go into them very easily. From the lymph capillaries, these guys will converge into what we call collecting lymph vessels. And these guys will start sending that lymphatic fluid that's full of just extra salts, water, pathogens, back up to your cardiovascular system. Now, what's cool about these lymphatic vessels is that along their path, you're going to have these little bubbles that you see. Those are lymph nodes. These guys, biggest thing about them is that they are filtration units. They are what filters all of your lymph. And inside your lymph nodes, you have a ton of immune cells, like your T cells and your B cells, that actually are there to fight bacteria that might come in. The collecting lymph vessels will then converge with each other to make lymph trunks, and then the lymph trunks will converge to make lymph ducts. And next to lymph ducts, go ahead and put 2 parentheses and put the number 2 inside of it because you only have 2 of these. The 2 lymph ducts are going to both empty into the veins that are close to your neck, and we'll see where these actually are in a coming illustration. So what you're seeing here is the the lymph capillaries, which you see are nubs at one end. They're nubs at one end because they intertwine with the blood capillaries. And this is where they're actually picking up any fluid or bacteria that the blood capillary wasn't able to pick up. So the lymphatic capillary is in green, and it's going to come and converge all together, as we see in this illustration, to make what's called collecting lymph vessels. And those little bumps you see along them are going to be the lymph nodes. So as you go along, you have lymph nodes, lymph nodes. Eventually, these collecting lymph vessels with their lymph nodes will converge to make lymph trunks, then lymph ducts, and the lymph duct is what actually converges with the vein to dump all the fluid back into the heart. Now, if we take a really close-up look at the lymphatic capillary, you see it's a single cell layered thick, and it has little flaps on the sides of them. These are like mini valves. They allow things to come in, but they don't allow things to leak back out. So we went from lymph capillaries, then to collecting lymph vessels, And along the collecting lymph vessels, we saw that you're going to have lymph nodes. You have about 500 lymph nodes all along your collecting lymph vessels, and these lymph nodes, again, are your filtration system. Some lymph nodes you can actually feel, like the ones around your neck, the cervical regions, the ones under your armpit, and the ones in your pelvic region. These are all considered superficial, and when you get sick and you feel those areas, you'll feel little bumps because those lymph nodes are inflamed. The ones that are deeper in your tissues that you cannot feel are the tracheobronchial ones, which, just like the name states, is in the tracheal bronchial region. That's going to be near your lungs. The ones in the aortic region, and the ones in the iliac region where you have your iliac arteries and veins. And this is just an illustration of where you have them. And you're going to see that you have the inguinal ones here. You have the iliac ones here. You've got axillary ones in the armpit region, and then cervical ones right here in the neck region. These are the most common ones that we feel for because they swell up pretty large, and they can easily be felt by simple use of finger motion on the neck. Now, what does each lymph node look like? Well, they kind of look like kidneys, to be honest with you. And in kidneys, you have blood coming in and out from the ileum. But what's interesting about the lymph nodes is that you have lymph fluid coming in from what we call the afferent lymph vessels. Remember, afferent means it's coming at you. And all that lymph comes into here, filters through this region, and then once it's filtered, it goes out of the efferent lymph vessel. All of these cells that you see in here are T cells and B cells. Those are immune system cells. So if you're a healthy individual, the lymphatic fluid coming in should all be familiar to your body. They should all present your self-antigens, not any kind of foreign antigen. And those T cells and B cells will say, oh, I know these guys. These are our own cells. Let's not attack them. But if you do get sick with a viral or bacterial infection, that virus or bacteria is going to come in. The T cells and the B cells are going to say, hey, I don't recognize that antigen on that cell. Let's attack it. That's when the lymph node swells up because it's now allowing a lot more fluid to come in, because it says, hey, if we found one or two of those viruses in this fluid, there must be more in the body. So it dilates these afferent lymphatic vessels, and a lot more lymph fluid starts getting in and filtering so that this lymph node can start multiplying the T cells and the B cells, sending them out of the lymph node. And if you recall, once you leave lymph nodes, you go into lymph trunks, then lymph ducts, and then it dumps into your cardiovascular system, your blood. This is where your T cells and B cells are going to want to go. Leave the lymph node, eventually get into the blood, because once you're in the blood, where can you get pumped to? Well, the rest of your body. So now you're going to be able to have an immune system response to the rest of your body. So again, we did lymph capillaries. And then we went to the collecting lymph vessels, which is where we saw those lymph nodes. And collecting lymph vessels will then fuse together to make lymph trunks. There are 5 lymph trunks in your body. I'd like you to know the names of all 5 of them and where they're from. Lucky for you, the name basically tells you where they're from. The lumbar trunk. Well, you've seen this word lumbar in the lumbar vertebrae. It's down below the abdominal/pelvic region. So this is going to bring all the lymph from your lower limbs. Intestinal trunk brings the lymph from your intestines. The bronchomediastinal trunk, well, broncho, we need bronchioles. That's going to be in your lung/thoracic region. Subclavian trunk, under the clavicle. So this is going to be from your upper limbs, so your arms. And then the jugular trunk, where you would find the jugular vein. And that's going to be bringing lymph from your head and your neck. Now, I want to give you a little bit of extra information on this because this one's kind of cool. There's some interesting pathways we have here. This is your vertebrae, obviously. Here's your lumbar region, and the lumbar trunk is going to be this area here. That lumbar trunk is going to be the trunk that brings the lymphatic fluid from the legs. Your right leg would be here, your left leg would be there. So you collect all the lymph from left leg and right leg. And when you converge it all together into this opening where you converge all of the lymph that comes from your lower leg, your femur, your pelvis, your other leg on this side, it's going to converge at this place called the cisterna chyli. You converge all of those from the lower limbs in the cisterna chyli and move it up in just one freeway up your abdominal cavity towards the thoracic. Right here, do you see this split? This is an important split. If you keep going up along that split, this is called the thoracic duct. If you go to the right, this is now called the right lymphatic duct. So again, the cisterna chyli travels up the abdominal region and it splits into the two ducts that I told you to put that number 2 next to. So you have 5 lymph trunks and they fuse together to eventually make 2 lymph ducts. So you have the thoracic duct, and follow my laser as we go all the way around. And look, it eventually converges in with the left subclavian vein. That's going to eventually send the blood to the superior vena cava, which we know dumps into the heart. That would be right here. The other one is called the right lymphatic duct. Follow it up, follow my pointer, up, 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 and right there. This is where it converges with the right subclavian vein to again go into the superior vena cava and into the heart. So the lymph ducts are called the thoracic duct and the right lymphatic duct. Now, how do you actually move lymph? Well, this is really the same thing as how you move blood through the veins. Number 1, the more you contract your skeletal muscle, the thicker the muscle becomes, the more it compresses on the walls of the lymphatic vessels to push that lymph up. Nearby arteries, remember arteries have high pressure blood in them, that high pressure pulsates the arteries, and again, that helps push the lymph up. This is not very strong, but nonetheless, it is there. Thoracic pressure changes, that just means when you breathe in and when you breathe out. Whenever you breathe in, your pressure is going to decrease in your vessels, and the vessels will expand to allow that lymph to move in. During expiration, you're forcing the air out, so pressure is increasing in your thoracic cavity, and that's going to cause the lymph to move as well. Valves of lymph vessels. Now I left this blank because I want you to fill it in. Just like valves in the heart and in the veins, what do valves prevent? If you said backflow, you would be correct. Valves prevent backflow. They stop the lymph from falling back down towards your legs. So these are all ways in which you can move lymph fluid. Now, what the heck is lymph fluid made out of? I've kept saying the word lymph fluid, but if you've ever popped a pimple, first thing that comes out is the pus, and then after that, if you keep pushing, before the blood comes out, you have this like clear fluid that comes out. That clear fluid is lymph fluid. It's mostly water. It does have some sugar in it. It has salts in it. It has amino acids. Anything that wasn't able to be picked back up from the tissue into the blood capillary is gonna eventually go into the lymphatic system. And remember, the lymphatic system picks up extra fluids to take it back to the cardiovascular system, but sometimes in the tissue, it's not just extra fluids, salts, and sugars, but you have bacteria. So the bacteria will also get into the lymphatic vessel. It goes through the whole process, but the key thing with bacteria is that you really want it to get filtered into the lymph node, because in the lymph node is where you're going to start your big immune system response to start killing those pathogens. And we'll talk about that more at the end of this PowerPoint. So the composition of lymphatic fluid, because it's mostly water, it is clear and colorless, but it is really low in proteins. The proteins, you really want them to stay in your blood rather than in your lymph. So it's made mostly of water, the T and B cells, which are called lymphocytes. You have other white blood cells called granulocytes. You got some gases, nutrients, salts, and hormones. It will vary throughout the day depending on activity and depending on the diet. You can click on this video whenever you'd like. I'm not going to go over it right now. We're just going to keep pushing forward, and we're going to move to the last part of this PowerPoint called the immune system. Now, the immune system, as you all know, has the biggest job of protecting you from getting sick, but sometimes it's unable to defeat the pathogen. So its main job is to identify the pathogen, build an army against the pathogen, and go to your blood and travel throughout all your blood and tissues to kill the pathogen. Now, the immune system needs the help of the lymphatic system because that's really where a lot of your pathogens end up going into to get filtered through the lymph nodes, to get identified by the T and B cells, and elicit or begin the immune system response. So which lymph tissues and organs are we really focusing on here? Well, number one, like we said, lymph nodes. These guys are filtering the lymph and making sure that there is or there isn't any pathogens. The spleen is going to be an organ that's in like the upper left region of your abdominal cavity. And this houses a lot of T and B cells, but also we said was the graveyard of red blood cells. The thymus is going to be right above your heart, the tonsils, the aggregated lymph nodules. This is just a really fancy way of saying lymph nodes in your intestines. And then the last thing is your appendix. It does have a function, my friends. So let's go over the primary tissues now. So if I go back, these guys are the organs of the lymphatic system. These guys are the tissues of the lymphatic system. Now, before I read anything, I just want to show you what this is. Here's an intestine. Inside the intestine, you have these ridges, and on those ridges, you have those little tiny fingerling projections called cilia or villi. These guys have internal tissues behind them in this area here that act as immune system centers. So this is the cartoon, but if I were to show you here are the ridges with the finger-like projections, and behind it towards the base, you see these lighter colored regions, they're circles. These guys are follicles. These guys house a ton of immune cells because think about it. Is the food you eat clean? Well, probably not. But you really count on your stomach acid to kill a lot of the bacteria. But if it doesn't, that bacteria is going to go from your stomach into your intestines. And who's going to fight off that bacteria then? Well, you have this tissue called malt, like a malt ball, that candy, it's spelled the same. Malt, mucosa associated lymphoid tissue. This is considered a mucosa because it's covered in mucus. Like if you literally were to open up someone's intestines and you were to touch it with your finger, it would be very slippery and slimy because it's covered with mucus. You have regions like this in your digestive tract, like the intestines, the urinary system, like the vaginal canal, fallopian tubes, respiratory system, and reproductive tracts. And these malt tissues are what house a ton of the T and B cells, just because we know that the intestines get a lot of interaction from external things. Respiratory system, you're breathing in sometimes dirty air. Reproductive tracts do have interaction with the external environment. So you want to make sure you have all your bases covered. Now, this illustration just shows you where the lymph organs are, the ones that were from 2 slides ago. You got them in yellow, tonsils, thymus, you got bone marrow, spleen, which is here, and those aggregated lymph nodules with the appendix. Now I put these 2 in red because these are called primary lymph organs. The black ones are secondary lymph organs. The primary lymph organs are where you have production and maturation of your lymphocytes. What were the 2 lymphocytes that we talked about? One is called a T cell. One is called a B cell. Here's the deal. Your bone marrow makes T cells and B cells. But what makes them different is that the T cells that are made in the bone marrow, they move and transition into the thymus to mature. The B cells that are made in the bone marrow stay in the bone marrow to mature. And what I mean by maturing is that your immune cells are born as like any other cell as a baby. They need to mature, they need to understand how to fight infection, they need to learn how to recognize your own cells versus a foreign cell so they don't start attacking you by accident. That's what they're doing when they mature here. So thymus is T cell maturation, bone marrow is B cell maturation. But where are both of those cell types initially made? In the bone marrow. So this is my favorite slide because this is as much physiology as you're going to get here. I'm going to tell you how the B cells and T cells work, our lymphocytes. So you guys already kind of learned this with blood. Everyone has cells, and on those cells you have antigens, those flags that are your identification tags. A bacteria cell is going to have different antigens than your own personal cells. So antigens is what T cells and B cells are actually looking at. They don't look at the cell as a whole. They literally look at the identification flag. So these antigens are what we're going to be identifying and attacking by the T cells and the B cells. Now I'll tell you how the B cell works first. This is kind of cool. So a B cell, this guy, he doesn't attack anybody, but he's kind of sneaky in how he actually fights off bacteria. Here's your B cell. When a B cell identifies a foreign antigen, he shapeshifts into a plasma cell. So he grows in size and he starts making these little arrows that go pew, 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 and they shoot out. These are called antibodies. What we know so far about antibodies is that they bind to antigens. So the plasma cell will make very specific antibodies for the antigen that it doesn't recognize. The antibody binds to the antigen. Now, on its own, this does nothing. This is really doing nothing except for sending off a big siren. And when an antigen and an antibody bind together, this complex sends off a huge siren that will catch the attention of macrophages. It ends in phage, so we know it does phagocytosis. This guy acts like the Pac-Man, and he's going to come open his mouth and eat any cell that has an antigen-antibody complex on it. So basically, the B cell turns into a plasma cell. The plasma cell makes antibodies. Antibodies bind to antigens to make these bacteria edible by the macrophages. So that's how a B lymphocyte works. So did the B lymphocyte actually kill the bacteria directly? No, the macrophage did. But you needed the B cell to make the antibodies to actually tag the bacteria so that the macrophage could see it and eat it. Now, what is the big difference between T lymphocytes? Well, these guys are the Mac Daddy attackers, the frontline fighters, because the T lymphocytes are going to be able to see the bacteria, identify the foreign antigen, and bind to them directly. So here's your T cell, here's its receptor, and it binds directly to the antigen. When the receptor on the T cell binds to the antigen on your actual bacteria, that right there is a signal to the T cell to say, hey, we just bound to something that wasn't good. Let's start making chemicals that are going to kill this guy. So the T cell starts making chemicals and it starts perforating the membrane. The word perforation or perforating means to create holes in the membrane. And these T cells have the chemicals to make hundreds of thousands of holes in this guy's plasma membrane. What's going to happen if you make 1,000 holes in the plasma membrane? Well, the plasma membrane is going to start breaking down and the whole cell is literally just going to fall apart and die. That process of cell suicide and death is called apoptosis. This is a term I want you to know. So now to finish off this PowerPoint, we're going to go through the lymph organs, and I'm going to give you some details on them. So the thymus, remember, starts with the letter T. This is where your T lymphocytes mature. This is not where they're made. Where are T cells made? In the bone marrow. But the thymus's one and only job is to help T cells mature. And how does the thymus do that? Well, he makes something called thymic hormone. Thymic hormone is the hormone that causes lymphocyte maturation and differentiation. That means that when an immature T cell goes to the thymus, it gets a signal from thymic hormone. That immature T cell becomes larger, it matures, and it's able to differentiate, that means morph, into specific forms of the T cell that are going to go to different parts of your body. Now, the lymph nodes, we kind of went over this already. These guys filter the lymph. This is where really your first immune cells are able to identify the virus. And this is where they identify the virus by identifying the antigens of that virus. Your tonsils, very, very simple. You have 4 sets of them in the back of your mouth. And these guys are there to, again, gather, remove any pathogens that you might inhale or eat. The spleen is your largest lymph organ. It's also one of your heavier organs because it is dense and full of cells and blood. The spleen is where you have dead red blood cells. You have a ton of B cells here. And the reason the spleen has a lot of B cells, because remember how, and I'm going to go back to it, remember how the B cell turned into a plasma cell to make your antibodies? This process happens in the spleen. It doesn't just happen any which area that you'd like in your body. So the spleen is the site of B cell maturation into plasma cells. Next to this, you can write produce antibodies. This is also where you get rid of bacteria, any worn out red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. This is like your recycling plant, essentially. This is also where you store platelets. So those little tiny fragments of macro cells that are able to clot blood. And that's going to be the end of this slideshow. So go ahead and study this. This is for Monday, March 16. And I will keep you posted as to what we're going to do for the lab on Wednesday. We are still figuring it out as a department, but it's most likely going to be an online activity for you guys to complete. Anyways, if you need help with anything, send me an email and I can do FaceTime office hours with any of you. Be safe, be healthy, and I will see you all